Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Amy Goodman is the executive producer and host of Democracy Now!, the daily news magazine show on radio and television. What's most notable about her broadcast is that she reports news that most others don't and does it her own way. She's also the author, with her brother, of The Exception to the Rulers, which talks about the media a lot and what we know and who the people are who give us the news the way they see it or they do it. Tell me about this book.
Well, the title, The Exception to the Rulers, should not just be the motto of Democracy Now!, the program that we do every day. It should be the motto of all the media, the exception to the rulers. That's what we're supposed to be. There's a reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one that is explicitly protected by the U.S. Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on government.
I always grew up talking, they used to talk about the Fourth Estate. That was the ultimate check and balance, right? That disappeared.
Yeah, it's now an annex of the White House and the Pentagon. I mean, the media are the most powerful institutions on Earth now, more powerful than any bomb, than any missile. The Pentagon has deployed the U.S. media, and we have to unembed it. We have to take it back. The media has reached an all-time low, and it's our responsibility to ensure that there are eyes and ears that are independent of the government, holding those in power accountable.
So you believe in a democratic media, meaning that all views should be heard.
Yeah, an independent media that is not an extension of the government, that is not there on bended knee, but is there especially in times of war, invasion, occupation, presenting the full gamut of views, and especially in a time when dissent is almost criminalized, when you're called unpatriotic. There couldn't be anything more patriotic than to express your views. And there's no one that protects more than those in the military, U.S. servicemen and women. Years ago, I went on the Sally Jesse Raphael show during the Persian Gulf War, and it finally aired, the broadcast. She was going to stop it. She was having women on for and against the war. But when it finally went on, the most interesting response I got was from women on Southern military bases who called up to say, we've never heard this view on television, and we agree with you. Here were women who were going to war, or their loved ones were, to kill or be killed. I don't know which is worse. And they were saying that they can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to have these discussions. I see the media as a huge kitchen table, sort of an extension of this one, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: war and peace, life and death, and anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country, is a disservice to a democratic society.
So, thinking about this whole thing, it's hard. We have to explain it to people because the media has already influenced them to believe that there's nothing wrong.
As Noam Chomsky says, it manufactures consent.
Right. Isn't that, it's so true. I mean, it is, it's so hard to bring this direct line to lots of people and have them believe you because they've been so brainwashed the other way.
Right. And it serves to alienate people because they don't hear an echo of their own views. I mean, we're not talking about, when you talk about people who are opposed to war, that is not a fringe minority. It's not a silent majority. It's the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, and it's people across the political spectrum. I mean, before the invasion, it's such an important point that you raise of the effect of the media. Before the invasion, the group FAIR did Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, did a study of the 4 major nightly newscasts, ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. A few weeks before the war, they looked at the nightly newscast for 2 weeks. Of the almost 400 interviews done, only 3 were with anti-war representatives. That's unbelievable, at a time when most people were opposed to war. That is a media beating the drums for war, and it's unacceptable. It's extremely dangerous. The media should be a sanctuary for dissent.
This is all explained in great detail in this book, which is really fascinating. You list the study, you talk about FAIR's study, but you also list some of the government proclamations that were issued, the news releases that came out, and the lies that they are.
Oh, I mean, weapons of mass destruction, of course, is the biggest lie. We have this controversy over Newsweek, whether the Quran was desecrated, when report after report lets us know that this is the case. And the FBI has known this for years. When they said, because there were protests in Afghanistan, when people learned of this and people died, and they said the blood is on the hands of Newsweek. I mean, I'm no great defender of Newsweek, but in this case, let's look at who the blood is on the hands of. Look at the biggest lie of all, weapons of mass destruction. Did the administration take on the media and say, why did you trumpet this? Of course not, because the media was acting as a megaphone for them.
Yeah. Well,
those are the lies that take lives.
How do we account for this? How did this happen?
Because the media goes on bended knee to those in power,
and
is cowed by those in power.
We're talking about print media as well as...
I'm talking print, I'm talking the New York Times. In fact, in the book, we have 2 chapters on the New York Times. And I think it's absolutely critical. The one chapter is called Lies of Our Times. Front page pieces, continually, week after week, month after month, right. Judith Miller, the national security correspondent, and her colleagues, unnamed sources, you can't source it back, alleging weapons of mass destruction. Afterwards, after all it came out, the Times has this box on page A10. It says the Times, something like letter from the editor, the Times in Iraq. It's okay, then maybe they got it a little wrong. Right? They call it their, well, some call it their mea culpa, I call it their kinda culpa. Well, that is not enough, buried inside the A section. It's got to be on the front page, above the fold, top billed in the same way those reports were. Otherwise, people will never realize. And many people still believe weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq, not because they're stupid, but because they are good media consumers.
Right.
Over and over. What matters is not the occasional expose, but what appears on a regular basis. Now there's some self-scrutiny within the industry, but that is not enough. They have to turn to, first of all, the whole issue of unnamed sources is unacceptable, except in cases of whistleblowers or people whose family or they themselves could be harmed, like in East Timor or in Haiti, at places where really, if you speak out. But the level of abuse of just taking a government official who doesn't want to lie traced back to him and just not naming him, and it gives you more credibility because it looks like you've got an unnamed source and then you can be the source of the next leaked lie, unacceptable. Violation of the basic tenets of good journalism. The media's got to change. And I think it is. I think there is a whole independent media infrastructure that's building in this country.
Let's talk about, because you also talk about the independent media centers that are around and the coverage, for instance, of in Seattle, of the Seattle conference.
Oh, yeah.
And how people didn't even know that there was this whole group of people that come and make all these different changes in the laws of countries.
Right. I mean, you take the World Trade Organization protest, the Battle of Seattle in 1999. This was a true Gettysburg of the 20th century. It was a real turning point. Why would people know about this obscure organization founded in 1995 in Geneva, sort of basically secret, supranational, right? It's above nations. So the corporations couldn't stop legislatures, democratically elected legislatures like you were on the city council, passing laws that said things like we won't do business with companies that do business with Burma or with Sudan or with Indonesia. And so they were losing there. So they said, okay, let them pass their little laws. We'll challenge them at a supranational level. And this was around issues of public health. And so doctors, nurses, public health professionals get concerned, farmers about bioengineered foods. And enough people, a critical mass, started to realize this is subverting democratic legislatures in countries around the world. And so when the WTO met in Washington, in Seattle, and mind you, yes, it was under Bill Clinton, 50,000 people came out. Farmers, nurses, religious people, students, environmentalists, unionists, the whole gamut. And they marched to the streets of Seattle. Second time since World War II, they declared martial law in Seattle, the largest export city in the country. It was absolutely critical. And many people realized that they could not view this uprising, this global uprising against corporate power, through a corporate lens. And so they took their pens and their papers and their video cameras and their still cameras to the streets, and they started to monitor what was happening.
And that's because the major media, if they did show it at all, they were showing people with the bandanas
right.
over the
they
face.
Didn't even. They only got there after, and they
right.
show a pane of glass broken. Is that why all these people had come, as to bust the windows of Starbucks? I don't think so. In fact, even that story, which they showed that over and over, people lined up outside of Starbucks and they locked arms to stop people from vandalizing particular stores. That wasn't the issue. The issue was a much larger one. And that's when really the independent media movement and indiemedia.org was born. And soon more people were hitting indiemedia.org to find out what was happening on the internet than they were CNN.com. I mean, Pacifica, where I come from, WBAI in New York, and Pacifica nationally, founded 56 years ago by a conscientious objector who said, we don't want to, we need a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. It's very much been on the forefront and has built network of community radio stations around the country. And we felt it was critical to bring all of this together. Indie media, Pacifica Radio, and public television, and public access TV, like here, this wonderful place that is CUNY TV. These are all very precious and important places where people can make their own media. And they're not doing it to serve some corporate agenda, but for educational purposes. That is absolutely critical. And bringing them all together, what a difference that makes. It is a breath of fresh air, and it is a mighty force. Together, we can break the sound barrier.
You just mesmerize me. I sit here and listen to you because you really, you're in a position now to so totally affect what people are thinking and to really make change, which is really so stupendous. I want you to talk about this book and where it is on the sales lists and how many people are reading it and where you travel. And don't be modest, just come out.
Well, the book did hit the New York Times bestseller list, and that's very important because in a lot of these chain stores, that's what determines what gets there. Yeah. And you want to reach as a large an audience as possible to introduce them to a whole new universe of ideas. We've spent a lot of our time in traveling around the country. I wrote it with my brother, David Goodman, who's also a journalist, working with independent bookstores. And they, too, like radio and television, public radio and television, are incredible sanctuaries of dissent. And we must shore up the independent bookstores. There used to be over 4,000 of them, and now there are little over 1,000. Yeah. People should know, sure, you can go to Amazon.com to check out what the latest book that's published, but when you actually go to buy it, go to an independent bookstore. They need the support, where actually those that are selling the books have read some of them, right. And you can come in just saying, I don't know, I feel like today, and they can say, well, talk a little more. Okay, I'll bring you to a section of the bookstore.
And that you pay for position in a bookstore, in a large bookstore.
Oh, we've learned so much about this, right?
It's unbelievable,
called co-op
isn't it?
Space, right. Yes. You thought it was just because the people in the bookstore loved it,
right.
And so they put it, they pay for it all.
Right. Yeah.
And we have to really challenge the corporate control of information.
The story I think that's most easy to really illustrate what's happening to us is the Jessica
Lynch
story.
Oh, how we were manipulated.
That was total manipulation, right? I happened to come at it from a different way in that the doctor who first saw her in Germany was a doctor who came from a neurological hospital in Phoenix, where we had been years ago when Jimmy had his aneurysm operation. And the word came back from Phoenix that Jessica Lynch was run over by a truck. But it was at the time when everybody was talking about how she was shot and how they had this whole release, and you go into it in great detail.
Oh, these are the myths. I mean, we're talking psyops come home. That's psychological operations come home. And there's the modern corollary.
I mean, because that was fascinating.
Right. You've got
well, let's tell us generally what happened to Jessica Lynch and the fact that she wasn't liberated out of a hospital with guys with
right. I mean, this was at a point when the U.S. military was extremely bogged down. They needed some kind of myth to galvanize public support. And here was this young, brave woman who was in a hospital, and they engineered this raid at night where they were using their night scopes, and they videoed all of this to get it out to the media. And they said that she was being held by the Fedayeen in a military-occupied hospital, and they freed her. Well,
I remember seeing these soldiers going up the staircase with their guns drawn.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
I remember
Pentagon
the news film.
footage.
Right.
Pentagon footage. And it turns out that the doctors deeply cared about taking care of Jessica. They didn't think, these are hospitals devastated by sanctions for 12 years. They gave her the best room. They were giving her round-the-clock care. And they wanted to get her to the U.S. forces so that she could be helped. And they actually brought an ambulance to bring her, but they were shot at. And so then they bring her back to the hotel, and to the hospital, which was hardly a hotel. They were trying to get word to say, take Jessica. Yeah. No, she wasn't shot, and they said that she shot to the last, not to say she wasn't brave. Yeah. And they did this to say that, this was a big success story. Another huge lie was the Pat Tillman story, the NFL player, and now his family is speaking out. Think about this, these two major lies. The military, the family knew from the very beginning there's something wrong. It ended up he was killed by, I don't even like the term, friendly fire.
Such a terrible term.
But again, in both these cases, and we have to get beyond the Pentagon lies, and that means an independent media not concerned that if they report a story, they will be iced out. Because let's face it, the government needs us much more than we need them, than journalists need them. And the way we save a democracy is by having an independent press.
If the network news accepts, we don't even know how many of the Pentagon films footage they accept in their different news reports.
Oh, everything should be identified. The big scandal of a quarter of
a group of us challenged WPIX for its license back in the 70s, 60s, because they used Army training film from Fort Belvoir, Virginia, saying it was live from Vietnam. It was. That's the kind of thing that is so terrible because it's distorting everything.
And now it's morphed into VNR's video news releases, where our taxpayer dollars, $250,000, are going to make these pseudo news stories that end up in local newscasts around the country. And you have PR professionals changing their names to be the anchors of these, or worse, you have the local reporter taking the transcript and the narration and reading it themselves around the clips that are provided by some 20 government agencies. Now, why this is of such concern, for me, it wasn't so much the actual pieces, it was that you couldn't tell the difference between, yes, the pieces, that's egregious, but between the pieces and the rest of the newscasts that they were couched in. What has the media become in this country?
Now, why is that? Is it because it's controlled by so few people, large corporations? Is it the control? Is it that people are afraid? It's a combination of everything, isn't it? A lot of people self-censor, don't they?
That's a very big problem. It's much less than the person coming in, the big editor, and saying, you will not do the story. It's what reporters understand will either bring them up the career ladder or marginalize them. Like saying, I want to cover the peace movement is probably not a very a career path that's going to help them. And raise questions before the invasion. What about these weapons inspectors who are saying it doesn't hold water? These are people within the military and intelligence, and doing features on them because they were being iced out of the Times, which was setting the agenda, the New York Times, for the rest of the press. But I think you put your finger on it, Ronnie, and that is the issue of who owns the media. We are talking about this great proliferation of channels. People know it from cable, from satellite television. But who owns them? That's what counts. And there are fewer and fewer media owners. That matters. We have to understand that that is the greatest threat. People have this illusion. We knew in the old Soviet Union, the people there knew. Read between the lines. This is not the truth. But here, with all the channels, there's this sense of you'll get it somewhere. But what matters is who owns them.
And I think what people say, we've made stars out of newscasters. They've become celebrities, and we believe them, and they're not.
The good news, I think, is that the not finding weapons of mass destruction in Iraq exposed more than the Bush administration. It exposed the media that acted as a conveyor belt for the lies of the administration, and so people across the political spectrum are asking for some very serious questions.
In this book, you also talk about the rulers, the people who are in power and what they're doing, the conflict of interests, the cronyism that goes on. There's a chapter, what is it called?
The oligarchy.
The oligarchy.
I mean, what we're seeing in Washington is the ascendancy of the oligarchy. You have George Bush, who was a failed oil man. You have Dick Cheney, who headed the largest oil services corporation in the world, Halliburton. Condoleezza Rice, as Secretary of State, sat on the board of Chevron Corporation for over 10 years, had an oil tanker named after her, the Condoleezza Rice, and you can go on from there.
Did you, and now we see in the paper the other day that Dick Cheney's daughter is the second in command in the State Department of the Middle East or the Far East Bureau, and her husband, his son-in-law, is the chief counsel to Homeland Security. Now, I mean, I've been trying to figure out, is that right or not? I don't know.
It's a family affair, and I think what's most interesting is where you don't find these family members of those in power. You don't find them in the battlefield in Iraq, the Bush daughters or the Cheney family, Rumsfeld. And that really matters, not to wish that on anyone, but who is actually sent to fight the battles of these men.
So poor people. It's people who are either in the National Guard to add more money to their income, or it's poor people who have no jobs. They're evidently having a lot of trouble recruiting, right?
Oh, they're not meeting their recruiting goals.
What do you find as you travel around the country? Because you have been traveling a lot.
Yes, it's been quite a trip. In the last year, doing about 150 cities. Really a tremendous amount of hope. People are organizing everywhere. I mean, right now we're moving on the 60th anniversary of the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and people are saying it comes full circle. And we have a chapter in the book called Hiroshima Cover-Up, and we challenge the New York Times reporter versus an independent reporter named Wilfred Burchett, who went to Hiroshima, saw with his own eyes when the U.S. military was saying you shouldn't come here, and said there's some kind of atomic plague, a bomb sickness here, and sat down in the rubble with his Hermes typewriter and tapped out the words, "I write this as a warning to the world." William Lawrence wrote for the New York Times. Instead, he wrote about how people were not dying of radiation sickness. That was Japanese propaganda. I mean, this rings true today. He went back to New Mexico with other reporters, called there by Leslie Groves, the general who was in charge of the birth of the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project. And he wrote a series of articles really denying that there was radiation sickness and glorifying the dropping of the bombs. And he ultimately won the Pulitzer Prize for his reports. And we've called for the Times to be stripped of this Pulitzer. It turns out that William Lawrence was on the payroll of the Pentagon, as well as the New York Times. He wrote the press releases, he wrote the statements for Truman and Stimson, and he wrote the articles. This whole embedding process, embedding reporters in the troops or the military, has got to be challenged, and the precedents that were set long ago have to be challenged as well.
You illustrate that also, but it's where you lose your identity. I mean, why are you there? Become part of a team when you're embedded with a group, right? You lose your judgment, your dispassionate attitude.
Right, and if you're going to have reporters embedded in the front lines of troops, have them embedded in Iraqi hospitals and communities, have them embedded in the peace movement around the world.
So you're very optimistic about the future.
I am. I feel it is people organizing. That's what makes the difference, and I think people are doing it at every level and across the political spectrum. This whole blue-red state thing, I don't think helps us in any way. At Pacifico, we talk about the purple strategy, but I mean, we're finding conservative Republicans like progressives care about Social Security, care about privacy, care about corporate control, and out-of-control war budget, more than 1,600 young servicemen and women who have died. I think everything is changing. I think everything is changing, and the Democratic and Republican Party will follow the leaders, and the leaders are the people.
Which is the basis, then you come back to your whole question about media should be democratic media, and that the news should come from the people up. I see the hope as trickle-up journalism. And I encourage reporters always to steal the story from our website at democracynow.org. I mean, we break stories or cover stories on a regular basis every day with our show, which is grassroots, global, unembedded. That's how we bill it. Were you astonished, just a little detour, that people were surprised when this memorandum surfaced in England about the fact that the United States government was disingenuous in its efforts to secure peace? I mean, how could people...
that they were gunning for war months before.
Right, but didn't we all know that?
I mean, first of all, I admire you, Ronnie, just for having noticed this, because this is the kind of memo that is the smoking gun that hardly anyone even, not because people are stupid here, but because it's very hard to even find this out. And we need a media that honestly covers what's going on, because lives are at stake.
Now, where do you get your courage when you go to press conferences or you meet with people? How you're this lovely, sweet-looking,
thank you,
just lovely, light figure, and you stand up to people and ask questions that are direct, right to their heart, stab in their heart. Does it make you nervous?
Sure, but I think that the responsibility is to the people who can't be in that room, who can't ask those questions. My model, I have her on my mind very much now because I just went to visit her, but my 108-year-old grandmother, who was, all of, something like 4'8". My parents, my dad and my mother, who taught women's studies and was a real peace activist and deeply believed in social justice, as my dad did. My brothers, I wrote this with one of my brothers, with David Goodman. And I think we have to stand up for what we believe is right, and also for people's right to speak. That's so important. I'm not going to say stand up for the truth, because I think there are many truths. And that's especially important in a fundamentalist age, is to talk about those many truths. And that's what the media is there for, to hear the discussions and the debates, because, I mean, democracy is dynamic, and it has to be vibrant discussions to come up with the strategies that work. The only place we really get to meet now, unless you know someone personally, is through the media. That's why it is so important. The most important institutions on earth. It's the way we communicate with each other. It's the way we learn about the rest of the world, and it's a way the world learns about us. And it can't just be through a corporate lens.
Thank you very much, Amy Goodman. It shows that principle brings you a lot of courage. And fortunately for us, we have you out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie.